I still remember that Sunday afternoon, as if it had been carved into the grain of my memory. The roast was steaming on the long oak table, the scent of rosemary drifting through the dining room, and for a moment anyone walking in might have believed we were the picture of a happy American family. Sarah, my daughter, was laughing a little too brightly at one of Daniel's stories. Michael, my youngest, passed the mashed potatoes down the table with the quiet steadiness that always reminded me of his mother. Outside, the neighborhood was alive with the ordinary rhythm of small-town Ohio. A dog barking across the street, kids pedaling their bikes. Before supper, the church bell tolling faintly in the distance. It was one of those dinners meant to feel comforting, the kind you expect to bring people together. Sarah had called me earlier in the week and said, "Dad, why don't you come by Sunday after church? Daniel wants to grill and the kids will love to see you." I wanted to believe in that picture. I wanted to believe that even after all the uneasy looks and the hushed arguments I'd overheard between Sarah and her husband, we could still gather around a table without tension crackling in the air. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. Daniel was dressed as always. Pressed shirt, gold watch. Catching the light, every detail, too polished, too practiced. He had that grin he wore like armor, showing just enough teeth to appear friendly, but never quite reaching his eyes. He poured himself a glass of wine before anyone else and raised it just slightly higher than necessary, as if the gesture alone announced his place at the head of things. I sat down across from him, folding my napkin, slowly watching the way Sarah leaned toward him. My daughter had once been so independent, quick to challenge anyone, including me, when she thought I was wrong. But now she smiled carefully, almost nervously, as though she were measuring each expression to match Daniel's approval. It cut me deeper than I wanted to admit. Michael broke the silence first. "Dad, did you see Pastor Allen's sermon this morning?" His tone was light, but his eyes flicked toward me with a subtle warning, as if he felt the tension rising before it was visible to anyone else. I nodded. I did. He spoke about trust. How it's the hardest thing to give back once it's been broken. I didn't miss the way Daniel's smirk twitched at the corner. The food passed around the table, dishes clinking, but beneath it all I felt that same undercurrent I'd noticed for months. Daniel filled the space with talk of business deals, new developments, and a vacation he had earned out on the coast. Every word was soaked in self-congratulation, but carefully wrapped so it sounded like casual conversation. You should have seen the look on the banker's face when I walked in with the numbers he boasted cutting into his steak. People don't expect a man of my age to handle figures like that. But then, I suppose not everyone has the same drive. Sarah laughed on cue, though her eyes slid down to her plate. Michael pressed his lips together, choosing silence. I took a sip of water, letting the weight of Daniel's words hang in the air. To anyone else, it might have seemed like ordinary table talk, but I knew Daniel too well. Beneath his stories was always a message, one pointed in my direction. He liked to remind me in ways both sharp and subtle that the house they sat in, the furniture, under them, even the ground we gathered on, was standing because of money I had once loaned. Money I thought was meant to support Sarah's future, not inflate Daniel's pride. As the evening shadows stretched long through the window panes, the small talk turned heavier. Daniel leaned back in his chair, wine glass swirling between his fingers. "You know, it's funny," he began, eyes glinting. "Some people spend their whole lives working hard, saving every penny just to end up sitting in someone else's home at the end of it all. Makes you wonder what success really looks like, doesn't it?" Sarah shifted uncomfortably. Michael's fork froze halfway to his mouth. "And me," I smiled, calm as the still surface of a pond, though I felt the ripples stirring underneath. I let his words sink into the silence, every syllable sharp as a tack in the room. Daniel thought he had won something by saying it, that he'd planted a seed of humiliation in me. What he didn't understand was that I'd heard worse in my life from bosses who underestimated me, from neighbors who thought I'd never amount to much, from creditors back when I scraped just to keep the lights on. Words alone never broke me, and his certainly wouldn't. Michael cleared his throat, trying to cut the tension. "Dad, how's the garden doing? Did you ever get those tomatoes in the ground?" I smiled at him, grateful for the lifeline. "They're coming along. The soil's stubborn, but I've been more stubborn." That earned a chuckle from him, and even Sarah's lips twitched at the corners, though her eyes never quite lifted from her plate. Daniel wasn't finished. He never was. See, that's the thing. Hard work is admirable, sure. But at some point it's about knowing when to pass the torch. Younger blood has the energy, the ideas. Holding on too long well, it doesn't look good, does it? He said it with a smirk, but the words were meant to sting. I leaned back, feeling the wood of the chair press against my shoulders. I thought of the years I'd carried Sarah on those shoulders at county fairs, of the nights I'd stayed up working double shifts so she could go to college debt-free. Daniel wasn't just mocking me. He was mocking everything those years represented. I caught Sarah glancing at me, then her face pale. For a brief second I saw the little girl who used to tug my hand in the grocery store, begging for one more box of cereal. There was shame in her eyes now, and fear of what Daniel might do if she didn't play along, fear of what I might say if I pushed back. So I chose not to push. Not yet. Instead, I folded my napkin, neatly laid it beside my plate, and looked Daniel square in the eyes. Success, I said evenly, isn't about where you sit. It's about how you treat the people sitting with you. The air shifted. Michael set his fork down slowly as if to mark the weight of the moment. Sarah's hand trembled on the stem of her glass. Daniel blinked just once, his smile faltering before snapping back into place. He raised his glass in a mock toast. To progress, he said smoothly, into the future we're building. I lifted my water glass, clinking it lightly against his. To remembering the past, I replied. For a heartbeat, the room was silent, just the sound of the clock ticking on the mantel. Outside, a car passed by, its headlights gliding across the curtains. I felt the world narrow down to the faces at that table. My children, my son-in-law, each one caught in a web they didn't yet realize I'd already started to untangle. Dinner went on, laughter forced, conversation strained. Daniel carried on with his tales of investments, his plans to expand to elevate the family name. I nodded along all the while, filing each word away. Every boast was another brick in the wall he was building around himself, a wall I knew would eventually collapse. By the time dessert was served, I decided something let him enjoy his triumphs for now. Let him believe the game was his to win. Because the louder he bragged, the harder his fall would sound when truth came knocking. As I rose to leave that evening, Sarah hugged me tighter than usual, as though her arms were asking forgiveness her lips couldn't form. Michael walked me to the door, his eyes searching mine. "You heard everything, didn't you?" he asked softly. I patted his shoulder. "I hear enough," I said. And sometimes son, hearing is all the proof you need. On the porch, the night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of cut grass. The porch light above me flickered once, then steadied. I stood there for a long moment, staring out into the quiet street, knowing the illusion of harmony had cracked, and that soon the truth would find its way to the surface. The night after that Sunday dinner, I sat on my porch with the crickets buzzing in the weeds and the hum of the streetlight flickering above. I thought about the way Sarah's hands had trembled on her glass, the way she avoided my eyes when Daniel made his pointed remarks. A father knows when his child is caught in something bigger than words. I had raised her to be strong, but I could see how his presence bent her spirit like a young tree leaning against a constant wind. A few evenings later, Michael stopped by. He didn't call ahead, just pulled his old Chevy into my driveway, headlights washing across the garage door. When I opened the screen door, he was standing there with a six-pack of root beer, the kind we used to drink together when he was a teenager. "Thought you could use some company," he said, handing me a bottle. We sat on the porch steps, the boards creaking beneath us. For a long while, we didn't say much, just watched a couple walking their dog down the block, and the neighbor's flag flapping in the warm breeze. Then Michael cleared his throat. "Dad, I don't like the way he talks to you," he said quietly. "Or to Sarah. It's like he's trying to prove something every time he opens his mouth." I took a sip, let the sweet fizz settle before answering. "I've noticed," I said, "but Sarah's made her choice. She's tied herself to him." Michael leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I think it's more than that. He's not just arrogant, Dad. He's slippery. You know, I caught a glimpse of some paperwork on his desk last week when I was helping Sarah with the kids. It looked like he was moving money around. Investments, loans, things that didn't make sense for someone already stretched so thin. That word loans landed heavy. My chest tightened. I'd given Daniel money, yes, but always under the belief that it was for Sarah's security. not to puff up his pride or dig them deeper into debt. I didn't tell Michael everything, not yet. Instead, I said, "You keep your eyes open. And don't let him drag you into anything. Promise me that." He nodded, but the worry lines on his forehead didn't ease. Later that night after Michael left, I sat at the kitchen table flipping through an old photo album. Sarah at her high school graduation grinning with her tassel crooked. Sarah, at 8 years old, holding a sparkler on the 4th of July, the night sky bursting with color behind her. And Sarah as a baby, bundled in a thrift store blanket when I was still working 2 jobs and wondering if I'd ever give her the life she deserved. I remembered the nights I came home so tired I could barely stand, but I'd still rock her to sleep because she wouldn't settle without hearing my voice. I remembered counting coins at the kitchen counter to buy her school supplies, telling her it didn't matter that her backpack wasn't brand new, because what she carried inside her wit, her kindness was worth more than anything on a store shelf. Those memories were a balm, but also a blade. How had we ended up here with her sitting at a table where her own husband used my sacrifices as a punchline? A few days after that, I went by Sarah's house unannounced. I brought a pie from Mrs. Hendricks down the street, the one she insisted I share with the family. When Sarah opened the door, her smile was polite, but it didn't reach her eyes. She looked tired. Her shoulders slumped as though she carried a weight she couldn't set down. "Dad, you should have called," she said, stepping aside. "I thought I'd surprise you," I replied. Inside, the kids were playing on the floor, building towers out of plastic blocks. Their laughter was the only sound that felt pure in that house. Daniel wasn't home, and for that I was grateful. Sarah and I sat at the kitchen table. She poured coffee into mugs, her hands unsteady. "Everything all right?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, "Daniel's under pressure. Work has been stressful. He wants to make sure we're secure." Secure, how I pressed. Her lips tightened. "He's working on some investments. He says it's all for our future, for the kids." I wanted to believe her, but I saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes. When I left, I noticed a stack of envelopes on the counter. Bank logos, return addresses from financial firms. The kind of mail that never used to land in Sarah's kitchen. That night, I pulled open my own file cabinet. Old receipts, loan agreements, copies of the checks I'd written to Daniel. I flipped through until one page stopped me cold. It was a notice from the county recorder's office, slipped in with my property tax statements. I hadn't paid much attention before, but now the words jumped out. Change of deed, pending review. And there, in faint print, was Daniel's name, listed beside Sarah's like he'd already begun to weave himself into what was mine. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, that notice trembling in my hands. My eyes ran over Daniel's name again and again as though repetition would make it disappear, but it didn't vanish. It sat there like a stain proof that he wasn't satisfied with what I had already given. He wanted it all. The next morning I drove into town. The old courthouse stood where it always had, red brick, weathered by a century of Ohio winters. Inside, the clerk at the recorder's office recognized me. We'd gone to the same church years back. She lowered her voice when she saw the paper I slid across the counter. "This was filed just last week," she whispered. "It's not final yet, but he's trying to add his name to the deed. Without your consent, that's questionable at best." I thanked her, folded the paper carefully, and stepped back into the sunlight. The courthouse lawn was busy with kids chasing pigeons, and an old veteran selling flags. For a moment, the normalcy of it all felt cruel. Here was life going on while mine was being carved away behind my back. That evening, I called Michael. We met at the diner on Main Street, the same booth where I'd taken him for pancakes when he was little. The place smelled of bacon grease and coffee, comfort in its own way. He slid into the booth across from me. "You found something, didn't you?" he asked, eyes searching mine. I laid the folded notice on the table between us. His jaw clenched as he read. "He's trying to take the house." "He already started," I said, "but he doesn't know I've seen it." Michael's hand curled into a fist on the table, then relaxed. "Dad, you can't let him get away with this. Sarah might be blind to it now, but if he succeeds—" "I know," I said. My voice was steady, but inside something fierce was rising. "This house isn't just wooden shingles. It's every hour I worked, every sacrifice your mother and I made. He thinks he can erase that with a signature." We sat in silence as the waitress refilled our mugs. I stared at the steam curling up from the coffee, and a plan began to take shape in my mind, not reckless, but deliberate. If Daniel wanted to play with paperwork, I'd show him that two could play that game. When I got home, I pulled down a dusty box from the closet. Inside were documents I hadn't looked at in years, loan agreements, old trust papers, a file I'd kept on the advice of an attorney long retired. I spread them across the table, the weight of the past staring back at me. Among them was a letter from Carter, my old friend, who had practiced law before retiring to a cabin out by the lake. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but I knew he'd answer if I called. Carter had always said paper tells the truth people try to hide. At the time, I thought it was just a saying. Now it sounded like prophecy. I tucked the notice into the folder, closed it tight, and felt a grim resolve settle in my chest. Daniel thought I was an old man too tired to fight. He thought Sarah's silence and my patience meant surrender, but he was wrong. The next time I saw Daniel, it was at Sarah's house again. They'd invited me over for dinner, something that once would have felt ordinary, but now came wrapped in unease. I drove slowly through the neighborhood, the familiar lawns trimmed and the sound of sprinklers clicking in the evening light. From the outside, their house looked perfect, fresh paint, a flag waving from the porch rail, flower beds blooming along the walkway. But I learned long ago that appearances are the easiest thing to fake. When I walked in, the children ran to greet me. Their laughter filled the hall, a momentary balm. Sarah followed behind, smiling a smile that felt too practiced. Daniel stood further back, phone in hand, scrolling as though he were too busy to notice me arrive. We gathered around the table once more. The smell of lasagna filled the room. For a while, conversation hovered on safe ground, the kids' school projects, a potluck coming up at church, the weather shifting toward summer. But it was never long before Daniel steered things his way. You know, he said casually, cutting into his food, there comes a time when a man has to step aside and let the younger generation handle things. It's just how the world works. The fork paused in my hand. His tone wasn't sharp, but the message was. Sarah glanced at me quickly, then down at her plate, as though she could hide the conflict in her eyes. Michael wasn't there this time, and I felt the absence keenly. Daniel leaned back in his chair, smiling that thin smile of his. You've done well, no doubt. But why keep clinging to responsibility when it only drags you down? Isn't retirement supposed to be about peace? Let us handle the future. There it was plain as day. Not just arrogance, but intention. He wasn't satisfied with his own path. He wanted mine too. I set my fork down slowly. I'm not opposed to peace, I said, but peace doesn't come from handing over what you've built. It comes from knowing the people you love will honor it. Sarah's hands tightened in her lap. For a moment I thought she might speak, but Daniel cut in before she could. Honor is a fine word, he said lightly, but these days it's paperwork that matters. Power of attorney trusts deeds. Without that, all the old ideals don't mean much. The way he said it made the air in the room colder. Sarah's eyes flicked up at me wide, as though begging me not to react. My jaw tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. I'd heard stories at church potlucks, and in line at the pharmacy, of families torn apart not just by greed, but by those few legal words that gave control to someone else. Power of attorney. It was supposed to be a safeguard, but too often it was a weapon, and Daniel knew it. Dinner limped along after that conversation hollow. When I left, Sarah hugged me at the door, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll call you later, she said, though we both knew she might not. Driving home, I felt the weight pressing down harder than ever. Daniel's words weren't just careless anymore. They were calculated. He was planting the idea in Sarah's mind, normalizing it, paving the road for a future where I no longer had a say. A few evenings later, the letter came. It was tucked in with the rest of my mail utility bills, a flyer from the grocery store, the usual. But the envelope that bore the bank's logo made my stomach turn before I even opened it. Inside was a notice about a pending mortgage application, one I hadn't filed. The details were clear. The property listed was my own home, the applicant of record, Daniel Harris. My hands shook as I read it. He hadn't just talked about control, he was already reaching for it. And if the bank had sent this letter to me, it meant the process was already moving. I sat at the kitchen table with that letter spread out before me, the lamplight casting it in harsh relief. My name was printed there, but beside it was Daniel's. His handwriting, nowhere in sight, just the cold type of a bank's machine. Yet I could almost hear his voice in those lines, smug, certain he had already claimed victory. I read it again slower this time, my stomach tightening. The amount listed was steep, more than I had ever dared to borrow, even back when I was raising Sarah and Michael on little more than overtime pay and hope. And the property description left no doubt it was my home, the one I'd poured decades into keeping. Anger rose, but beneath it was something heavier. Betrayal has a weight that presses differently than ordinary pain. It doesn't just wound you, it rewrites the history you thought you shared. By morning, I knew I needed help from someone who understood the law better than I ever could. That's when Carter came to mind. We had worked side by side years ago in the old city hall, back when I still carried more black hair than gray. He was sharp, then sharp enough that even after retiring to his cabin by the lake, his name still carried weight around town. I dug out his number from an old address book tucked in my desk drawer. My fingers hesitated over the rotary phone, but I dialed anyway. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Well, if it isn't the voice of the stubbornest man I ever knew," Carter said. His laugh was rough, like gravel, but warm. "What kind of trouble finds you these days?" I told him everything about Daniel's boasts, Sarah's silence, the notice from the recorder's office, and finally the letter from the bank. My words came steady, but underneath I felt stripped bare, as though confessing a failure. Carter listened without interruption. When I finished, he exhaled slowly. "Sounds like you've got yourself a classic case of fraud. Forged documents, unauthorized applications." "He's moving fast because he thinks you won't fight back." "He's wrong," I said. "That's the spirit, I remember," Carter replied. "But listen, these cases can get messy. He might already have signatures he plans to wave around. If he's forged yours, that makes it criminal, not just civil. You'll need evidence. Hard documented evidence." His words steadied me. "Paper tells the truth. People try to hide." Carter had always said that. We agreed to meet at his cabin that evening. Driving out there brought back memories. The lake shimmered under the late afternoon sun, kids skipped stones to the shore, and Carter's old hound barked lazily from the porch. He greeted me with a firm handshake, his eyes sharper than his weathered face suggested. Inside, we spread my documents across his dining table. The notice from the recorder's office, the bank letter, old loan records. Carter studied them carefully, adjusting his glasses, scribbling notes on a yellow pad. "Look here," he said, pointing to the recorder's stamp. "This kind of filing needs either your direct signature or notarized power of attorney." "I see neither." "That means he either faked your name or slipped it past someone not doing their job. Either way, it's rotten." "And the mortgage application?" I asked. "Same story. Without your consent, it doesn't hold. But the bank doesn't know that yet. If Daniel's pushing it through, we'll have to show them proof before they release funds." His calm, deliberate tone reminded me of long nights years ago when we'd pore over city contracts. He always saw the angles, the loopholes others missed. "So what do?" I asked. "You gather," he said simply. "Every piece of mail, every scrap of paper with his name touching yours. Keep it organized. We'll build a trail. And then?" He leaned back, eyes narrowing with thought. "We give him enough rope to hang himself." I frowned, meaning Carter tapped his pen against the pad. "He likes to boast, doesn't he? To show off in front of family, then let him. But this time we'll be ready. You want the truth out, not just for you, but for Sarah and the kids. He's woven a story of control. We'll unravel it where it hurts him most, in front of the very people he thinks he's fooled." The suggestion hit me square in the chest. Confront him at a family gathering. Let him damn himself with his own pride. It was dangerous, yes, but something in me stirred at the thought. I leaned back in the chair, letting Carter's words settle like stones in a pond. The thought of a confrontation out in the open twisted my stomach. But there was something right about it, too. Daniel had built his power on shadows. Whispers and papers slipped through without notice. Bringing him into the light might be the one thing he couldn't stand. Carter poured us both a cup of coffee from a dented old pot, steam rising in lazy curls. "You don't have to roar every day," he said, his voice low. "But when the time comes, you remind them the old lion still has teeth." I sipped the bitter brew, remembering the years Sarah was little, the times I had swallowed my pride just to keep food on the table. Pride didn't feed a child, but it fueled me then and it fueled me now. Daniel thought my age meant weakness. He forgot that years also mean patience, and patience is a weapon when used right. We went over the documents late into the evening. Carter highlighted discrepancies, noted dates, and pulled out examples of where signatures didn't align. He spoke with the precision of a craftsman, every word sharpening the blade we would eventually wield. At one point, I found myself staring out the window at the lake moonlight rippling on the surface. "I never wanted it to come to this," I said quietly. "All I wanted was for my children to be safe, to know they were cared for." Carter didn't look up from his notes. "Wanting safety doesn't make you weak. Letting someone take it from you without a fight, that would?" His words landed with the weight of scripture. By the time I gathered my papers into a neat stack, the air between us felt heavier, charged. Carter reached into a drawer and slid across a formal document. His pen lay on top of it. "This," he said, "is a retainer agreement. It means I'll represent you. Quietly, discreetly, but fully. Nobody else needs to know, certainly not Daniel, until the time is right. Once you sign, you're not alone in this." I stared at the paper. The language was dry, full of legal phrases, but beneath it beat the heart of something more, an alliance. I picked up the pen, my hand steady. "You're sure?" I asked. Carter smiled faintly. "I've waited my whole career for a fight this clear." He thinks he's clever. But clever doesn't stand long against truth written down. I lowered the pen to the line, the ink flowing in a strong stroke of my name. When it was done, I set the pen aside and looked at Carter. For the first time in months, I said, "I feel like the ground under my feet belongs to me again." Carter nodded. "That's just the beginning. Now we gather, we prepare, and we let him walk right into his own trap." As I left his cabin that night, the air outside was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and lake water. The stars burned bright above, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the fire in my chest match their light. Daniel thought he had cornered me, but he had no idea the old lion had just sharpened his claws. A few nights later, I stopped by Sarah's house to drop off a pie Mrs. Hendricks had baked. It was something small, an excuse to see my daughter, to remind her she still had me, even if Daniel's presence loomed larger each day. When I walked up to the porch, the lights inside were dim. I lifted my hand to knock, but froze when I heard voices, Sarah's sharp, with panic, and Daniel's low and insistent. "You don't understand," Sarah was saying. "He'll know. He'll see right through it." Daniel's reply came cool, clipped. "He doesn't need to know. All you need to do is sign. The trust will be airtight. Once your name's on it, everything falls to us, and he's out of the picture for good." My heart hammered against my ribs. Trust. He wanted her to sign a new trust. It wasn't enough to worm his name onto deeds or push fraudulent loans. He was after the legacy itself, after every piece of what I had worked for. Sarah's voice cracked. "He's my father, Daniel. I can't just erase him." "You can," Daniel snapped. "And you will. Unless you want to see this house slip away. Unless you want the kids growing up with nothing. Don't be sentimental. It's number signatures, nothing more." I leaned closer, hand gripping the siding of the house. Every instinct screamed to kick the door open, to tear the pen from his hand and drag my daughter away from the table. But I stayed still because rage in the wrong moment could ruin everything Carter and I were building. Inside, I heard Sarah sob softly. "Please don't make me do this." Daniel's voice dropped lower, but every syllable still carried through the glass. "I'm not making you. I'm giving you a choice. Him or us. Decide, Sarah. Tonight." The words cut like a blade. I backed away, the pie forgotten in my hands, and slipped down the porch steps before either of them saw me. That night, back in my own kitchen, I sat staring at the pie on the counter, untouched. The walls felt closer, the house heavier, as if my very foundation was under siege. I thought of Sarah's tears, her voice breaking. She wasn't blind to what Daniel was doing. She was trapped. And it was my fault for not protecting her sooner. The next day, Michael stopped by. He had a way of sensing when I needed him most. Over mugs of coffee, I told him what I'd heard. His face darkened, his hands tightening around the ceramic. "He's pushing her to sign him control of everything," I said. "He's cornering her with fear, using the kids as leverage." Michael shook his head slowly. "That's not all. I've seen his briefcase, Dad. He's working on papers to file for conservatorship. He wants the court to say you're not capable of handling your own affairs. If he gets that through, he won't just have Sarah's signature, he'll have legal power to decide your life." The room seemed to tilt beneath me. I gripped the table, forcing air into my lungs. Conservatorship. The word alone carried a weight I'd heard whispered in church basements and senior luncheons, tales of old men and women stripped of their dignity by the stroke of a judge's pen. Michael reached across the table, his voice steady. "We're not going to let that happen. Not to you." The word sat heavy between us. Conservatorship. It was one of those legal phrases that sounded sterile on paper but carried a terror of its own. I had heard it whispered about in church basements, and at senior lunches men and women suddenly declared incompetent, stripped of every right they had spent a lifetime earning, left to live at the mercy of whoever held the papers. I rubbed my temples, trying to steady myself. "He's moving faster than I thought," I murmured. Michael leaned forward, his eyes burning. "That's exactly why we have to stay ahead of him. Dad, he's counting on you being quiet, on Sarah being scared. If we sit back, he wins. But if we act, if we get proof of what he's trying to do, we can stop him before the court even hears his name." His words reminded me of Carter's steady counsel. Paper tells the truth, people try to hide. Daniel thought he could twist the law into a weapon. What he didn't know was that I had my own allies sharpening the same blade. That evening, Michael and I went through the piles of mail I'd saved. Bank envelopes, county notices, even junk mail with Daniel's sloppy forwarding stickers. Michael scanned each one, his jaw tightening whenever Daniel's name appeared where it didn't belong. "Look at this," he said, holding up a letter with a bank's crest. "It's addressed to you, but it lists Daniel as an authorized party. He's already laying groundwork, probably so it doesn't look suspicious when the conservatorship papers hit." I took the letter in my hands, the weight of it making my stomach churn. Every move he makes is meant to erase me a little more. Michael shook his head. "No, Dad. Every move he makes is another chance for us to catch him." His confidence steadied me. Still, as the night stretched on, I couldn't shake the image of Sarah, tears streaking her face as Daniel pressed the pen into her hand. She was trapped between blood and vow, and Daniel knew exactly how to tighten the vice. Before leaving, Michael stood at the door, his shoulders squared. "I'm going to dig deeper. I'll find out exactly what he's planning to file and when. If he's moving on conservatorship, we need to be ready the moment he makes his play." Carter was already waiting on the porch, his hound sprawled at his feet. He stood as I pulled up, brushing crumbs from his shirt. "I figured you'd be here before long," he said, leading me inside. We sat down at his table, the same one we had crowded with papers before. Carter poured us both coffee, then laid out a fresh folder. Inside were copies of Daniel's filings Michael had described, already circulating, already aimed like darts at my name. "He's bold," Carter said, flipping through the pages. "Too bold. That kind of arrogance leaves a trail, and trails can be followed." I studied the documents, each one a reminder of how far Daniel was willing to go. "So how do we stop him?" I asked. Carter leaned back, eyes sharp. "We don't just stop him, we let him stop himself. Men like Daniel can't resist showing off. If we create the right stage, he'll brag, he'll lie, and in doing so, he'll hand us the rope." The words stirred something in me, like hearing an old hymn sung strong. "And the stage?" I asked. "Family," Carter said simply. "Dinner table neighbors close enough to notice, maybe even your HOA meeting. He'll want to look powerful. He'll want an audience. That's when we'll be ready." Later that week, Daniel strutted through the homeowners association meeting like he owned the neighborhood. The community center smelled of burnt coffee and copier ink, folding chairs lined up in rows. I sat in the back quiet, letting him think I'd been pushed into the shadows. Daniel took the floor with his usual flair-tailored suit slick smile. He talked about investment projects, renovations. He'd helped secure money he'd supposedly funneled into neighborhood improvements. People nodded at first, but soon the whispers started. Mrs. Green from down the street leaned toward her friend, eyes narrowed. Mr. Lopez crossed his arms, shaking his head. They weren't buying it. I kept my face calm as though defeated. Though inside I counted every word. Carter had told me silence is a weapon too. Let him fill it with his own noise. By the end of the meeting, Daniel was beaming, unaware the room was colder than when he began. Neighbors shuffled out, muttering doubts, planting seeds of suspicion that would spread faster than he expected. That night I drove back to Carter's. He slid a sealed envelope across the table. "It's a summons," he explained, filed quietly. "When the time comes, the police will be ready. We won't tip our hand until he tips his. I touched the envelope, feeling its weight. It wasn't just paper, it was the promise of justice waiting for the right moment. The following days moved with the quiet patience of a hunter waiting for his prey. I went about my routines as though nothing had changed, morning walks past the post office afternoons, sipping weak coffee at the diner evenings, watching the sun slip down behind the oaks in my yard. I waved to neighbors, nodded to the mailman, and let Daniel believe I had resigned myself to the sidelines, but every hour was part of the plan. Carter checked in often, sometimes dropping by with files tucked under his arm, sometimes phoning from his cabin with updates. He had a way of making the complicated sound steady, and each conversation hardened my resolve. Meanwhile, Daniel only grew louder. He paraded around town talking up some development project he claimed to be spearheading, though anyone who knew numbers could see through the cracks. At the grocery store, I overheard Mr. Lopez muttering that Daniel's figures didn't add up. At church, Mrs. Green pulled me aside, her voice low. "Your son-in-law talks big," she said, "but people are starting to wonder where all that money really comes from." I only smiled, keeping my words measured. Sometimes the truth takes time to show itself. Carter was right. Daniel couldn't resist the spotlight, and the brighter he shone it on himself, the more shadows appeared behind him. One evening, Carter and I sat again at his kitchen table. He slid a calendar toward me, a date circled in red. "That's when they'll be ready," he said. "Police paperwork, the whole net. All we need is for him to walk straight into it." "And the stage?" I asked. Carter's eyes glinted. "Family dinner. He won't be able to help himself. He'll boast, he'll push, maybe even wave papers around. That's when it happens. The officers will be nearby waiting for my signal. Once he crosses the line in front of everyone, the law will step in." I pictured it. Daniel, smug as ever, raising a glass at Sarah's table, convinced he had finally cornered me. And then the knock at the door, the officer stepping in, Carter, standing firm with the evidence in hand. The image steadied me like a hymn carrying me through a storm. As I drove home that night, the streets of our little town were quiet porch lights, glowing warm in the dark. My house waited for me, old but steadfast, the boards creaking under my feet as though whispering encouragement. I looked around the rooms I had fought so hard to keep, and I felt the weight of what was coming. Daniel thought the game was his, but soon he would learn the truth. The trap was no longer just an idea. It was set, and it was waiting. The evening came heavy with expectation. Sarah had called earlier in the week, her voice thinner than usual, inviting me over for dinner. "Just a family meal," she said, but I heard the tremor underneath. It wasn't her invitation, it was Daniel's stage, and we all knew it. I arrived at their house just as the sun was sliding low, painting the white trim of their big home in gold. Neighbors' cars lined the curb, though none of them were guests. They were simply home, their porch lights flickering on, ready witnesses to what none of us yet dared say aloud. Inside the table was set neatly polished silver, catching the chandelier's glow. Sarah moved quickly between kitchen and dining room, her smile brittle, like glass ready to crack. Michael was already seated, his eyes darting toward me with a look that spoke louder than words. "Stay steady. Tonight matters." Daniel entered last, carrying himself with the swagger of a man who thought he had already won. His suit jacket hung open, his tie loosened just enough to suggest he was comfortable in control. He clapped me on the shoulder as he passed, the gesture friendly on the surface but hard beneath. "Good to have you here," he said, sliding into his chair at the head of the table. "Family's important after all." We began eating. Sarah placed a roast chicken at the center, surrounded by potatoes and green beans. For a while, the clinking of silverware was the only sound, an uneasy rhythm beneath the chandelier's hum. Then Daniel lifted his wine glass, swirling it slowly. His smile spread thin and sharp. "You know," he began, his voice carrying just a little louder than necessary, "this house, this table, all of it. It stands because of one man's money." The air tightened as though even the walls leaned closer to listen. "Thanks to you," Daniel said, raising his glass in my direction. "This place is ours now. The mortgage, the renovations, the very roof over our heads. None of it would have been possible without your generosity. So tonight, let's drink to that." Sarah's fork froze midair. Her eyes darted toward me, then away again, cheeks flushed. Michael shifted in his seat, his knuckles pale around his fork. I set down my knife, lifted a piece of chicken onto my plate, and chewed slowly. I offered nothing but a calm smile. The silence stretched like a taut wire. Daniel chuckled, mistaking my stillness for surrender. Come, now, don't be shy. You've given us more than enough. And isn't that what retirement is, for sitting back, letting the younger ones carry the load? His words rang like a gavel. He wanted me diminished, seated at the table, but stripped of weight. I dabbed my mouth with a napkin, still silent. Inside, though, the spring was tightening every word of his bravado, pulling it back further. Across the table, Michael's eyes stayed locked on me, waiting. Sarah kept her head bowed, her hand trembling as she reached for her glass. Daniel leaned back, grinning wide. Really, you ought to enjoy these dinners more. You don't have to worry about bills or responsibility anymore. That's what we're here for, to take care of things. The trap was nearly sprung, and all I had to do was wait. Daniel poured himself another glass of wine, his laughter filling the room like smoke. It's funny, he said, gesturing broadly. I used to think keeping up with this place would be impossible. The mortgage, the upkeep, the bills. But then I realized it's not so bad when someone else already paid the price. The words hung there, thick and heavy. Sarah's eyes filled, and she pressed her napkin to her mouth as though it might hide her shame. Michael shifted again, his leg bouncing under the table, his jaw tight, with the effort of holding back. I let the silence linger. My fork scraped lightly against the plate as I finished another bite. I could feel the weight of every gaze, my daughter's, my son's, even Daniel's, as he searched for signs of defeat. Finally, he leaned forward, eyes glinting. You really should consider yourself lucky. Most men your age are worrying about assisted living or whether Medicare will cover their prescriptions. But you've got us. We'll make sure you don't have to think about a thing. He said it like a kindness, but the blade underneath was sharp. He wasn't offering care, he was declaring control. I set down my fork and folded my napkin with slow precision. My smile never faltered, though my chest burned. That's generous of you, I said, my voice even. To think so far ahead. Daniel smirked, raising his glass. Exactly. That's what leadership looks like. Planning for the future, making sure everything's in the right hands. Michael leaned forward, his voice breaking through the tension. And whose hands are those? Daniel. His tone was steady, but his eyes burned. Daniel chuckled. Ours, of course. Sarah's and mine. That's the way it should be. Sarah flinched, a tear sliding down her cheek. She whispered, Please, Daniel. But he waved her off. I placed my napkin beside my plate and straightened in my chair. My heart thudded in my ears, but outwardly I stayed calm. This was the moment Carter had prepared me for, the moment when Daniel, in his arrogance, believed he had silenced me completely. I looked across the table, meeting his eyes squarely. You've certainly made your case tonight, I said softly and almost conversationally. But you might find that not everyone here sees things the way you do. Michael's hand clenched into a fist on the table. Sarah wiped her eyes, caught between fear and something else, hope perhaps, though faint. Daniel tilted his head and amused, unshaken. Oh, and who do you think is going to disagree? The neighbors. The church crowd. They all know who holds the cards now. I let his words hang, then leaned back in my chair, calm as ever. I had waited long for this night, for this meal, for his pride to sharpen itself into a blade he couldn't sheath again. The table had grown colder, the chandelier's light harsher, every clink of silverware puncturing the silence. In that stillness, I knew the trap was nearly ready to snap. Then came the sound, a sharp knock at the front door, loud enough to make Sarah flinch and Daniel pause mid-sentence. Another knock followed, firmer this time, echoing through the grand hallway of their house. Daniel frowned, annoyance flickering across his face. Who on earth? At this hour, he muttered, pushing back his chair. But Sarah was already rising, her steps hesitant, as though she knew what waited on the other side. She opened the door and the cool night air spilled into the room along with two uniformed officers. Behind them stood Carter, steady as a stone, a thick folder tucked under his arm. The entire table froze. Michael leaned back slowly, a faint glimmer of satisfaction tugging at his lips. My heart pounded, not from fear but from the weight of justice finally crossing the threshold. Daniel Harris, one of the officers, asked, his voice clear and authoritative. Daniel blinked, a laugh bubbling up from his throat, forced and brittle. What is this? Some kind of joke? Carter stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Daniel. It's no joke, it's the law. He opened the folder, pulling out document after document, each one marked with stamps and signatures. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. She stared at the papers as though she recognized the lines of ink she herself had been pressured to sign. Carter's voice carried calm and precise. "We have evidence of forged signatures tied directly to your hand, Daniel. Property transfers, trust agreements, even attempts to secure conservatorship by deceit. You thought you were clever, but clever leaves fingerprints." Daniel's face drained of color. He shook his head, looking around as if for an escape. "This is absurd." He pointed at me, his voice rising. "He's old. He doesn't understand half of what's going on." "You can't just take his word." The officer cut him off. "We're not here on his word. We're here on documented proof." Michael folded his arms, watching quietly. I remained still, my hands resting on the table, my calmness a deliberate counterpoint to Daniel's unraveling. Then Carter pulled out one final set of papers. His expression hardened as he laid them on the table for all to see. "And here," he said, "tapping the page is the part you never expected to come to light. The funds tied to your father-in-law's 401k account. You used them as collateral for a private loan, without his consent, without his knowledge." Sarah gasped audibly, stumbling back a step. "Daniel, no. Tell me that isn't true." Daniel's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His jaw clenched, sweat beating at his temple. The room had shifted. Moments earlier, Daniel had held court, crowing over his supposed victory. Now, with Carter's steady voice and the officer's presence, he was cornered, every lie stripped bare under the harsh light of truth. The officers stepped further into the room, their presence shifting the air. Daniel's laughter had vanished, replaced by a tightness around his mouth. His eyes darted from Carter to me, then back again like a fox, circling the edges of a trap it had only just realized was there. "This is outrageous," he snapped, his voice cracking under the weight of it. "I've built everything you see here. That house, that business, me. Not him. He's just an old man clinging to the past." Carter didn't so much as blink. He spread the documents across the table, each page a nail sealing Daniel's coffin. Forgery, misappropriation, fraud. And now Carter tapped the final sheet: misuse of retirement funds, 401k accounts tied by law to their rightful owner. You gambled with his future to bankroll your greed. Sarah's sob broke through the tension, raw and pained. "You swore to me it was all above board," she whispered. Her face was streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she pushed back from the table. "You made me believe God, Daniel. What have you done?" For once, Daniel had no words. His chest heaved, his jaw worked, but nothing came. The walls that he had built with arrogance crumbled in silence. The senior officer stepped forward, pulling a folded sheet from his belt. "Daniel Harris, you are under arrest for fraud and misappropriation of assets." The sound of handcuffs clicking open was sharp, final. Daniel lurched back, knocking over his chair. "No, you can't do this. This is my house, my family, my—" But his words collapsed under the metallic snap of steel closing around his wrists. Michael sat straighter, his eyes never leaving Daniel's face. For the first time in years, I saw pride in my son's gaze, not the hollow kind Daniel paraded, but something solid, something earned. I didn't gloat, I didn't need to. I simply folded my hands together, breathing slowly as the storm passed over me. Justice wasn't loud. It was steady, like the ticking of a clock that never stopped. As the officers guided Daniel toward the door, Carter lingered a moment, his voice low enough for only the family to hear. "Paper doesn't lie, and the law, for all its flaws, still knows how to listen when the truth is written plain." Sarah crumpled into her chair, tears falling freely now. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I didn't force her to. The reckoning had come for Daniel, but the consequences would ripple through her too. The door shut behind them, the night swallowing Daniel's protests. Silence filled the dining room, heavy, yet strangely cleansing. I reached for my glass of water, my hand steady. For months, Daniel had believed he could strip me of my dignity, my home, even my voice. But tonight proved otherwise. He thought he had silenced me. Instead, his own arrogance had spoken louder than anything I could ever say. After the door closed on Daniel's protests and the night swallowed his voice, the house fell into a silence that was heavier than any shouting could have been. Sarah sat hunched at the table, her face hidden behind her hands, while Michael remained still, his eyes fixed on me. The clatter of silverware and the warmth of the food had long faded, leaving only the echoes of what had been torn apart. Michael was the first to speak. His voice was quieter than usual, stripped of the easy sarcasm he sometimes used to cover his nerves. "Dad, I don't even know where to start. But I want you to know I saw what you did tonight. I saw the way you held steady even when he tried to break you. And I respect that. More than I can put into words. His words caught me off guard. For so long I had wondered if Michael noticed, if he understood the cost of standing tall when the ground shook beneath you. Now I heard it plainly, and it struck deeper than any praise from the outside world. He leaned forward, his hands pressed flat against the table. You won't go through this alone. I'll take care of things. Whatever's left to clean up whatever fallout comes. This family isn't going to crumble, not on my watch. Sarah sobbed softly beside him, her shoulders trembling. She didn't lift her face, but I knew she was listening. Guilt clung to her like a shadow, and no words could strip it away in a single night. That weight would be hers to carry. The next morning, word spread quickly through town. In places like ours, secrets had short legs and rumors had wings. At the diner over eggs and burnt coffee, I heard my name whispered. At the post office, neighbors leaned together, shaking their heads. Daniel's fall was the talk of every porch and every pew. Some spoke with pity for Sarah. Some spoke with scorn for Daniel. Most just marveled at how arrogance, no matter how polished, always seemed to find its own downfall. As for me, I didn't feel the need to explain myself. I kept my steps steady, my greeting short but kind. The truth had walked into that house with Carter and the officers. It didn't need me to dress it up now. I remembered something Carter had said, a phrase that stayed with me long after the papers were stacked and the evidence sealed. Justice doesn't need shouting. It reveals itself, and that revelation was spreading through town like the morning light, steady and undeniable. In the days that followed, I noticed how quickly Daniel's image crumbled. Where once he had strutted down Main Street, waving at folks like a mayor in his own parade, now his name was spoken in hushed tones, followed by sighs or shakes of the head. The business contacts he bragged about cut ties overnight. At church, people who once endured his charm with forced smiles now whispered prayers for Sarah instead. I walked those same streets with no fanfare. Just steady steps. A few neighbors stopped me. Some clapped me on the shoulder. Others offered pies or casseroles, the language of small-town solidarity. They didn't ask for details. They didn't need to. The truth had done its work. One evening, Michael came by my house. He helped me fix a stubborn screen door that had been creaking for months. We didn't talk much while we worked, sometimes. Silence says more than words, but before he left, he paused on the porch. "Dad," he said, looking out across the quiet street, "I know things won't ever be the same. But I want you to know I'll be here, for you, for Sarah, for all of it. You carried the weight long enough. Let me carry some now." The porch light flickered above us, catching the tired lines in his face. He wasn't a boy anymore. He was a man, one who had watched the storm break and chosen to stand beside me when the air cleared. I rested a hand on his shoulder, the gesture, heavy with what words couldn't cover. "Justice doesn't need shouting," I told him, repeating the truth Carter had reminded me of. "It reveals itself, and so does family son, sometimes in the hardest ways." He nodded, his jaw set, and for the first time in a long while I believed him. As he walked down the steps into the dark, I lingered on the porch, the evening air cool against my skin. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed, and though scars remained, I felt something settle inside me. Not victory, not triumph, but a steady peace. The evenings grew quieter once the storm had passed. I found myself back on my porch most nights, rocking slowly in the old chair that had carried me through so many seasons. The wood creaked beneath me, steady and familiar, like an old friend reminding me I was still here. The air carried the scent of cut grass and wood smoke, the simple fragrances of a town where life, no matter how shaken, always found a way to keep moving. I thought often of Sarah. After Daniel was taken away, she withdrew for a time, ashamed, uncertain of her place between the father she had betrayed and the husband who had deceived her. The first time she came by, she stood on the edge of the porch, twisting her hands together, unable to meet my eyes. "Dad," she whispered, her voice thin, "I don't expect forgiveness. Not now. Maybe not ever. I don't want to lose you too." I studied her, saw the weight pressing down on her shoulders. There was no easy balm for betrayal, no quick salve for the wound she had been part of. But she was still my daughter. And though my heart bore the scar, it also carried the memory of when I had first carried her in my arms, small enough to fit in one hand. "You've already lost enough, Sarah," I told her gently. "Don't lose yourself as well. If you're willing to walk the long road, I'll walk it with you." She cried then, the kind of tears that wash more than just the eyes. She came back the next week and the week after. Sometimes she brought dinner, sometimes she just sat with me on the porch. We didn't talk much about Daniel. We didn't need to. Her presence was enough a sign that the bridge, though burned and scarred, was being rebuilt plank by plank. Michael was different. He didn't wait to return. From the moment Daniel was taken, he made himself a constant part of my days. He'd show up with groceries, tools for a project, or simply 2 cups of coffee from the diner downtown. He'd settle into the chair beside me, stretch his legs, and say, "What needs fixing today, Dad?" And sometimes nothing needed fixing at all. Sometimes we just sat there listening to the cicadas in the summer heat or watching the leaves turn when autumn crept in. For the first time in years, the silence between us felt full instead of empty. I realized then that justice had not only stripped Daniel of his mask, it had given Michael the chance to step into his own. As the weeks turned into months, life settled into a rhythm again. Not the same rhythm it once had, some chords had been broken forever, but a new one, steadier and more honest. I found comfort in the smallest things: the morning paper folded neatly on the porch, the smell of coffee drifting through the kitchen, the sight of Sarah pulling into the driveway with that hesitant smile that grew steadier each time. There were nights when I sat alone under the porch light thinking about all that had happened. I thought about greed, how it gnawed at a man until there was nothing left but hunger. Daniel had believed himself untouchable, and now he sat behind cold bars, the echoes of his arrogance fading into silence. Sarah kept showing up, her efforts quiet but constant. One evening she brought a pie she had baked herself, crust, a little too dark, filling a little runny, but it was hers. She placed it in front of me and said, "I just wanted to make something with my own hands, Dad." I cut a slice, tasted it, and nodded. "It's good," I told her. And I meant it, not because of the flavor, but because of the effort. That was her first real step toward mending what had been broken. Michael, true to his word, never let me carry the weight alone. He came by when the gutters clogged, when the car refused to start, when the loneliness pressed too hard. He didn't just fix what was broken, he stood as a reminder that family could still mean what it was meant to mean. One evening with Sarah on one side and Michael on the other, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. The hurt hadn't vanished, it never would, but it no longer defined me. Instead, what remained was something stronger, the certainty that I had not bent, not broken, even when betrayal had tried to strip me bare. I leaned back in my chair, my voice steady as I spoke words I hoped they would remember long after I was gone. Family is meant for love, not exploitation. In this country, greed always has its price. The porch fell silent after that. The cicadas hummed, the stars blinked faintly above, and the 3 of us sat together, not perfect, not unscarred, but still a family. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box to the right.